A couple of quick comments. As I said when we started this session, that the wonderful thing about the Chinese Goes Global Conference is that we have different perspectives on the same research question, the same topic. So as you've seen in this session by our wonderful three presenters, we had historical perspectives on on this topic, political perspectives, geopolitical perspectives, economic perspectives, and even now geographic perspectives. And I'm very interesting to know if anyone has seen this map before, by show of hands. Is that the first time? How many have seen this before by show of hands? 2. And if you think about this actually was done by a Japanese person, Hajime Narukawa, in 2016. It was actually reported in 2016 in December. He won a big design award in Japan to use origami technique to unfold a globe into a two-dimensional space. And that's why that autograph map looks like this. And interestingly, here from down under, which shows you, David, right, how a bloody long trip it is, right? You go to Australia, it takes the whole day, right? It takes the whole day, Mike. Right. So, and think about this, an accordion, I used this actually since then. It came out in December 2016. I've been using this for the last 3 years in my classes, showing my students. And the response rate is actually much lower than here. So here we had 2, or including me, 3 who have seen this map, my students, none of them. And that kind of shows us how long it takes to change our minds of how the world works. Because that world map we know about, where Europe is actually in the middle of it, was designed, I don't know how many hundreds of years ago by those explorers, right? Marco Polo and Magellan and all those explorers from Europe, from Spain, Britain, Portugal, and they put Europe in the middle, and they didn't really have the techniques at the time to unfold a globe into a two-dimensional space and portray distances in the proper way. And that shows us also that in many other respects, change takes time. And over the course of this conference, you've heard a lot of book recommendations. Here's one I recently came across by Elizabeth Economy. I don't know if this was mentioned. She writes a book about Xi Jinping called The Third Revolution. She's a fellow of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I had the pleasure to be invited by them earlier this year and interacted with Elizabeth Economy on that topic, the Belt and Road Initiative. And I really recommend that book for you to read. And what she basically makes the point is that China is full of contradictions. On the one hand, China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. They became the biggest economy in the world based on purchasing power terms in 2014. And that was actually 141 years of U.S. power, because the U.S. economy became the biggest economy in the world in 1873 when the U.S. overtook the British economy. And then in 2014, in the last quarter, China actually became bigger. And they've been growing so fast in the last 5.5 years that China now has the economic size in PPP terms of the US economy and the German economy combined. So they've become the biggest economy. As we learned earlier today, one of the presenters said that the current account of China is basically zero right now, right? Whereas Germany runs my home country, a big surplus, the US runs a big deficit. So theoretically, we strive for harmony, as one of our presenters said, and that's what China basically does. If you look at the current account, right, it's harmonized, it's balanced, if you think about this. There are more than 500,000 Chinese students who study overseas. There are tens of millions of Chinese who travel overseas. On the one hand, right, that's what she talks about, that China seems to be opening up. They hosted the G20 a couple of years ago. But on the other hand, there's that trend toward centralizing power. Xi Jinping, right, at last year's conference, got rid of the term limits, and he can basically run forever. So you have, on the other hand, a totalitarian movement, or a political movement toward a more totalitarian kind of stronghold, which you see all around the world. Look at Bolivia now. We have an election later on this year. Evo Morales is trying to do this. Look at what happens in the United States and in Europe, in many areas there. So, and for us, that seems to be a contradiction in the Western worldview, because we believe there has to be a correlation between certain types of political ideologies and economic developments and legal systems. Whereas maybe as symbolized by this new autograph world map, maybe those contradictions, which we believe are contradictions, are maybe the non-normal or new normal. And I encourage all of you to maybe think about this, how these discussions we have may change our worldview, what we believe is a worldview we are comfortable with in our contemporary world. And this world map should be in all of the textbooks, if you think about this. Right? It should be in all of the textbooks. Another funny observation before I open up, look at Brazil. if that would be a face and Brazil would be a nose, if you look at the old world map, it's a very tiny nose. On that autograph album, it's a long nose. I always, when I'm in Brazil and talk to students there, I say, it's because Brazil is so corrupt, so it's like Pinocchio. And they're laughing loudest because they know, it's correct.
Is it accurate in terms of distance?
Yes.
Chile is.
Chile, yes. So, but it's a very, very interesting perspective, and I think for the Chinese Road Belt Initiative, very good contribution, David, to bring this world map up, because that really shows us about distances and sizes right around the world.
So the map is in your eye, Billy? The map is in your eye.
No, actually it's not.
Oh, okay.
But you can find
you can Google it. You can Google it up autograph.
Oh, okay. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And you can see Hajime Narukawa, who made this up. You see the origami technique when it starts from a globe and it looks like a pyramid, and then he folds it up and you see how it is. And you can actually find those maps where you have that origami technique on the bottom. I have one in my office that big, next to the real one, not the real one, the old one, right? And then it's always interesting when you have students in the office to see the old one and the new one next to each other, then it's easy to compare those. I was really happy when I saw this one. When talking about geography and geopolitical issues, it's very, very interesting from a pedagogical perspective to bring this up. Not just to show distances, but to talk about, what we are programmed with. We grow up with a certain picture of the world, but it may not be accurate because this is not what we are programmed with, right? Talking in Gerd Hofstadter's terms, the programming of the mind. And that may be different. So what I would like to do is open it up for the...
That's about the map.
What's that?
That's about the map.
Yeah, please.
I mean, it's counterintuitive, but I always thought that the distance between Brazil and Africa is not there.
Right.
So, I mean, because you need the globe to come to the other side.
Exactly. So the distances
So
cannot
you
be
have
accurate.
to be able to
The scale is
behind the
accurate.
map.
Only the scale is accurate.
Okay.
So it's
Something like the Mercator
everything
map.
is to true scale, but in terms of the land mass
Right,
and the ocean. But the distances have to be distorted to flatten it into two
No,
dimensions.
that's
But the best map of Advanced Gamma was routed maps,
Oh yeah, this
which
is
are basically designed by industry. You see the world according to an industry sector. The map looks extremely
how
different.
large countries are based in their power.
Some very small countries are very large. Well, if we can ask questions, let us know.
Yes, what we
John, you're not that much different.
Well, I mean, that's precisely why. Okay, so let's open it up. And Jim, I think, started out saying that he's a rule taker today, and one of the rules was actually that each of the presenters read each other's papers, so that our presenters may have comments on each other's papers as well. And I will leave this up to you. I don't want to force anyone to step up first or last. But as we have this discussion, it's of course for the audience as well, that maybe you want to bring on some of your thoughts on those papers as well. But I know Ilan has been trying either to exercise his hand or to really ask questions.
Lifting weights.
So, lifting weights.
Patiently waiting my turn. I'm a rule taker, and a rule breaker.
Very good.
I think Chinese scholars can divide into two types: dragon slayers and panda huggers. And I think that to some extent, most of our presenters are panda huggers. We lean toward the panda hugging. We depict China, I think, in a generally net positive way as a contributor and as a country that we need to deal with. Even India, the biggest kind of regional competitor, that presentation was like, well, but we need to collaborate with them because we have no choice. My question actually goes back to the question that John McIntyre has brought earlier, and I want to bridge these two presentations because they're very, very similar, and get a perspective from both of the presenters that were in the previous and in this session as well, about whether, in fact, you think China can build institutions that the rest of the world can coalesce around and agree that this is the future of the world, or, in fact, are we stuck with our old institutions, and are we, if the American-led post-World War institutions are going to be sufficient?
I don't think it's either or. I think that there's a need to revive, renew, reorganize existing institutions for the 21st century. I think there's a danger. I think people are reluctant to accept Chinese rulemaking. especially the more democratic countries in the world, because it's not what they're used to. They want to say what it's going to be. So I think what we're going to see is something more like a reorganization of the existing groups that are more acceptable to at least the region.
I think, firstly on your point about people diverging, whether they're very positive or very negative, I think we have to be careful, in particular in relation to China. But
Notice I used the word leaning.
yeah, well,
Because-
I think that's right, and I think, I mean, I'm wearing my SDGs badge because I have a role with the United Nations in Asia Pacific, and you know, we would not have achieved one of the Millennium Development Goals had it not been for China. China essentially delivered the Millennium Development Goals. It rose 800 million people out of poverty.
But only
That-
domestically, right?
Well, domestically, but that's 800 million human beings. So we're used to a construction in which the lives of people in some countries are more important than others. But my point of view in using this map is that actually human beings are human beings. And so 800 million people, and not just China, but the whole of East Asia, that phenomenon of East Asian development has dramatically improved the world. And globalisation has dramatically improved the world. However, it's perceived as an enormous threat by some people in the traditional countries. So to make this point sounds like it's pro-China, but in fact there are deep problems with China. There are many problems we could talk about, at great length. Just as there are deep problems in the United States, which has been a wonderful rule maker, hasn't always abided by them themselves. So I mean, we could I would equally talk very positively about the United States and the great contributions made to the world order. And in fact, I think China wants largely to rise within that world order, but I think there are elements of it, such as in infrastructure financing, as I mentioned, where they have needed, quite frankly, to build new institutions, because those institutions were not delivering. So I think where there's a need for new institutions, they will try and build them. The AIIB, I went to visit the headquarters a few weeks ago in Beijing, and so naturally they've given me their PR version of what they're doing. But that it is a multilateral development bank that at least it tells us it is operating according to exactly the same norms and standards as any other multilateral development bank. So that tells us a lot. It tells us actually they've adopted a whole lot of the norms, but they're using those norms to then build something new. And I think that's the stage we're in. Whether we'll be in a stage in 20 or 30 years' time where that's not enough, that does worry us all, the comfort of democracies, because if China wants to get new institutions that don't abide by the norms that we're all used to, that's the risk, rather than I think what's going on today.
By the way, anybody else from the previous presentation, please tell me.
I have a quick comment. I think the Chinese have an enormous advantage that previous rising states did not. And that is, they have an existing set of institutions and values and procedures and arrangements that work, created mostly by the United States, but which the Chinese are extraordinarily good at studying, examining, understanding, and picking those that seem to have worked the best, without regard to what we may think of as the most important criteria of capitalism and democracy. They don't necessarily use those same values to find these things, but they use a much more practical and immediate, did they work or did they not work? The second point I guess I would make is, I don't think the Chinese had to do this alone. If we were smart, which is a big if, if we were smart, we would understand that we are facing a 20 to 40 year G2 arrangement. If we were smart. And we would cooperate with the Chinese in competing on building structural power, which we've done really well so far at. And the Chinese are starting, competing on that builds a greater level of a greater amount of deeper independence, and makes the world safer and not less safe. And if we were to do that, again, there's a big if here, I think the Chinese and the Americans could in fact create institutions and values and whatnot that would in fact work.
When Europeans would hear that, you are essentially making a case for a strong European Union. with or without Britain, because let's face it, Britain didn't join in 58, had a referendum in 73, almost didn't make it. So, you know, keep the Trojan horse where it is. Let's build a strong Europe. As a G3. As a G3.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not a big
Yeah.
fan of the Europeans as a third party.
No, I know that. But, I'm not aware of that. I understand. I'm Franco-American, so I'm well aware of these conundrums.
But can I bring us back to East Asia again? I mean, don't forget East Asia. I mean, you've got Japan, you've got Singapore,
Yeah.
tiny, I know, but in terms of building norms of
Yeah.
regional cooperation in the Asia Pacific
Yes.
region, you've got APEC, huge achievement, and you've now got the Regional Cooperation Economic Partnership, and we know that the TPP has not gone ahead with the US in it, but the rest of us are in it. The
Yeah.
TPP is going ahead as well.
Yeah.
So the possibility for institution building in Asia is not just about China leading it, but it's actually about China balanced by Japan, and, Australia and Indonesia and Singapore and all of the others. So there's the potential to, not just in terms of the G2, but there's the potential in the vertical in East Asia as well for a new kind of a balance to be developed. But if the mentality is that we must contain China, you'll never get that new balance in the Asian region. You'll increase more militarism.
Mr. Chair, I wonder if we could come back to in the remaining few minutes, something more micro. I recently gave a presentation to the Port of Savannah on the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative, and particularly the deep sea water ports. And indirectly you dealt with ports. So I note that the Port of Long Beach container terminal is now owned by the OOIL, namely in Hong Kong, the Orient Overseas International Ltd, Sri Lanka, Hambantota, Pakistan's Gwandar, Le Havre is 49%, Antwerp is 49% ownership, Bruges is 49%. So the question then becomes, what is the impact of this investment pattern, which is close to control, but not quite, because it doesn't reach the 50% border boundary in terms of the port authorities. But what to make of it? So my question that I addressed in my little talk, what's the impact of that on the Port of Savannah, which is the #3 port on the eastern seaboard of the United States? Can you expect more traffic? Because as you know, the Panama Canal is really 50% China origin traffic and China-bound traffic. So if all of a sudden China develops a different strategy as a result of ownership of this global port network, will the canal disappear into oblivion? You remember that China tried to buy the canal some years back, and of course under the treaty which links it to the United States, it's not possible. But so my question is this: for you guys who are focused on ports, what is the impact? If you are, you've got all sorts of important ports, not too far from here, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, in Brunswick, in Savannah, and then you go on up the eastern seaboard, even up to Canada. What happens to this?
Well, let me just say, at the time of the signing of the agreement with Trieste, the Eastern Adriatic ports, there was speculation that the European Union might introduce a limit on Chinese ownership.
Yeah.
It's a foreign, non-European ownership of the ports. And I think that could well happen. Something similar could happen here. I'm not saying, I'm not speaking in favour or against, but I think this is an issue that has arisen in recent years.
I mean, it's an interesting political question about whether a port should belong to the nation that it's in, or whether, under neoliberal economic theory, whether you just lease it to whoever's going to be the most optimal manager of the facility. And of course, that's been the philosophy. In Australia, ports are leased to Chinese companies.
Yes.
In Europe, ports are leased to Chinese companies. In particular, the European Union encouraged Greece to privatise its ports, and so naturally along comes a Chinese company that could demonstrate its best capacity to manage the ports. So
is this the return of the concession syndrome of the 19th century?
But with strong governments, you change the law. You see bad things, you change the law. I mean, the idea was you have to own things. Government still, if they are sovereign, can change the law.
One of the things, John, to this question, I'm not a port expert by any means, but about probably 12 years ago now, I think it was 2006-7, I don't remember, Dubai Ports World, they actually tried to acquire port businesses in the United States. And that was shut down based on complete lack of information, because what the Senate and the House members believed when they voted against this and didn't give the permission for that acquisition is they're part of the axis of evil, because they're all Muslims in the United Arab Emirates, even though they were fighting with the United States against the terrorists. So, and I guess, that kind of narrative we have coming out of our current governments against China as well, the bad guys. So that kind of informs the legitimacy of those kind of foreign direct investments in the United States. So I think it's probably, I'm not an expert, but a long way for us to give up, for us as U.S. Americans, to give up control of their port to the Chinese. I mean, I don't see that as easy, but again, it's a very,
highly symbolic.
Let me also recast maybe the question in a different way. If you look at the World Bank, World Governance Indicators, China fares quite badly. Now you would say, well, it's bad, but it's improving. But if you look over the last 20 years, there hasn't been much improvement in any of the governance indicators. Can we, the collective we, the nations of the world, trust China to develop a governance system for the world when, in fact, according to the World Bank, they haven't developed a governance system even for themselves that is of sufficient quality? So to the extent that you believe those world governance indicators, I think trust is a major issue. And it's a major issue that will block China from developing, from having followers, right? At the end, they could be all sort of institutions, but everybody has to buy into them. And with all the faults of the United States, I think even the African nations that benefit perhaps the most out of Chinese investment still perhaps trust the Americans more than they trust the Chinese.
Well, give them another 10 years of Trump and they would.
There's only another 4, not another 10.
You don't know this, Ivan. Look what happens in Bolivia.
And the Hungarian.
Ivanka Trump. Okay, we have about a couple of minutes. I want to make sure we are sensitive of time because there's another session in this room and other rooms at 3 o'clock. In this room, actually, the next session will be Chinese outward direct investments, so continuing the kind of, Chinese investments overseas. But if there's any last minute or last question I want to say, if not,
And maybe a Chinese perspective?
Yes,
That would be helpful.
We want a Chinese perspective.
I think
William,
the
you
European perspective is good. What you have said, for me, Europe is somewhere in the middle. USA,
Yes.
America is addressing China, or you want to mediate and talk. So the European perspective actually will sort of bring together the two views.
Speaking about ports, Israel was recently approached by the Trump administration, which Haifa port in Israel is run by the Chinese. And the Trump administration recently asked Israel to decouple from the Chinese. And they're in a very bad situation, right, to say no to Trump after all the goodies he threw at them. But they're very happy with the strong relationship with China. So Europe, in a sense, is in the same situation, stuck in the middle, bunch of nations that can't agree with one another on anything, not even managing themselves. And, most of the nations of the world are going to be stuck somewhere in between China and the US, having to make a choice. Are we with these guys here, or are we with these guys here? Which evil is the best one?
There's a really interesting example in my home country. So Australia is obviously a US ally and is completely integrated into the US intelligence network, as you know.
The Five Eyes.
As you know, the satellite bases in Australia, without those, the US would not have the global power it has. So you've got that entire integration of defence and military intelligence. But you've also got this entire economic integration. So Australia is the most integrated of the G20 economies with China. So it's an absolute triangle. So last week, the Australian Prime Minister was in Washington at the White House, and Donald Trump says to him in front of the media, you've told me you have all sorts of concerns about China. You can tell the media.
God.
And so the Australian Prime Minister turns to the White House press corps and he says, we have a very good relationship with China. We have a strategic partnership with China, which has been enormously beneficial to Australia. Thank you, Mr. President.
Chinese delegates want to say
yeah. So there's the time sign.
So one more.
Let's have one more perspective, but then we need to
Slightly
close.
Australian, very hypothetical question from a pure Chinese perspective. is this really due to the Chinese culture or ideological differences, or is the world also accustomed to get another new power? For example, let's assume if it was India, who is going to be the next superpower, have nations be more comfortable compared to, say, China, the next power?
Probably because they're democratic, I would say yes, but they're still badly governed. So probably from that point of view, that's no. Right? But if it was another European country, if Germany resurrected its power, maybe it would be more open.
Are you sure?
That's my Jewish perspective.
That's why we have the European Union. It's strange.
Okay, guys, with this said, let's give everyone a round of applause. And also in the back row, Nicole, who was the timekeeper, and Roland's college, give her a nice hand as well for those volunteers.